Welcome to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm Laura DiFrancesco, your host. We're talking all about mergers and acquisitions, buying and selling small businesses, as well as corporate law. We are taking our experience closing over $10 billion of transactions since founding Dean Street Law 5 years ago, and my experience being an M&A and corporate attorney for over a decade and making it accessible to you as an entrepreneur. I hope that this helps you in navigating the complex world of mergers and acquisitions. And also, we're always happy to be a resource for you here at Dean Street Law. You can always apply to work with us through our complimentary consultations linked in our show notes. And a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who's subscribed and left us a 5-star review. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe and also leave us a 5-star review. It's one of the best ways to support us as a small business. And also be sure to share with your friends and colleagues on social media, through text, email, or however is easiest. It means the world to us that you're supporting our content and helps us make more to support you in your journey. Welcome back to another episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I am so excited to be sharing a few new things with you. If you did not know already, my book is available for waitlist. We're so excited to soon be sharing the pre-order links and everything like that. You can download the first chapter of the book. It's Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a Legal Guide to Buying a Small Business. So if you haven't checked out the information on my book that's coming out, I would love for you to check it out. Join the wait list. It is going to be absolutely incredible, talking about so many different lessons to learn from the legal perspective to up-level your deal-making skills. So be sure to join the wait list, and we will get you the pre-order link as soon as possible. When it goes live, be sure to leave us a 5-star review because you know that makes our world go round. With that said, I'm really excited to talk about today's topic. Well, there we go. To talk about today's topic, which is how asset-heavy businesses impact your deal structure and terms. So if you are considering a business that is a manufacturing business or a business with a lot of heavy assets, talking about like tractors, equipment, manufacturing facilities, all of those vehicles, busing company, all of those are going to be quite a bit different than your traditional loans and traditional terms. So a few things that it's going to talk about that it's going to impact is, of course, financing availability. You can get asset-based lending instead of just your traditional types of lending, which may open you up more to a commercial loan. Also SBA loan and everything like that. From a financing perspective, though, it's important to really understand that most of the time that's going to implicate timing in some way or another. Likely the lender will require an appraisal of those assets to make sure that the valuation, since it's based on the assets of the business as well, is accurate. So that gets into another conversation around valuation. So with valuation, a lot of businesses are based on the potential future earning power of the business, whether that be a multiple of EBITDA, seller's discretionary earning, etc. There's a whole lot of things to consider when you're valuing a business that's very asset heavy. And you want to have these conversations up front because the seller may value the business differently than the buyer and may value those assets differently than the buyer. So when you're talking about your pre-LOI due diligence and your immediate post-LOI due diligence, what are we looking for you to really understand, which is what are the assets? If it's a trucking company, how many trucks does that include? How often are they replacing them? And what is the current lifespan of those assets? Depreciation, of course, is a consideration because in asset-heavy businesses, the amount of depreciation that's been taken can drastically influence the tax consequences. But the current value of those assets are primarily driven by the lifetime use value and the amount of life that is left, and then the replacement cost of that. So for instance, let's talk about printing companies. So a printing company, commercial printing company, may have 1 to 2 printers that handle all of the business, all of the orders and job orders of the business. So if you have one that's doing 90% of it, but you're paying for two, does that really make sense, or should that be an excluded asset? So when you're thinking about asset purchases versus stock purchases, especially thinking about valuation and an asset heavy business is very important, because you may not want to buy every single asset, especially if it's no longer a performing asset. And when you have some of this equipment, printer or manufacturer or whatnot, that's 300,000 plus 200,000 in 2 years to install or something like that, whether you include every single asset is really important. And so valuation is going to be driven by a lot of those factors, whether it be considerations of depreciation that's been taken and the value and life of the asset, the replacement cost of the asset, and how much is it still relevant to the business at hand. You have 5 trucks that are no longer used. And then also, in any business you're thinking of, are there assets that really shouldn't be sold within the sale of the business because they are vehicles of the owner or something like that. So you also have to think in those asset heavy businesses, are all of the assets currently in use? If they're not, why aren't they in use? And which of those assets are worth something to the buyer? So all of those conversations are going to drive valuation, which is a really important component of a transaction. That'll impact your purchase price, the assets that are defined to be included with that. If it's an asset purchase, if it's a stock purchase, those assets may need to be taken out of the business prior to closing. They may have no value to the seller though. So you may be able to, from the buy side, if they're not performing assets, it may be of value to have them, or it may be a cost to have them. So those conversations need to be had prior to closing so that how those assets will be dealt with can be determined by the parties. And let's talk about some other common challenges here, aside from just the valuation and defining which assets will be purchased and which won't be, which is the tax element. So when you're talking about depreciation, that can pretty significantly impact the numbers, but a lot of people don't realize that that can impact the numbers post-closing quite significantly as it does. So the other thing is that when you're having a transfer of business and asset purchase versus stock purchase, is that in certain states, when it's an asset heavy business, it's actually a bulk sale. And so you have to look on a state by state basis as to what the bulk sale tax law is and whether you're actually taxed as a buyer on the sale of those assets. Because obviously, most of the time, buyers aren't considering that they have to pay a tax for the assets that they're purchasing or the business that they're purchasing. They're thinking more of like, I'm spending money, so the seller is generally responsible for the tax that they receive. And then, I have things like, do I have a step up in basis and that kind of thing going forward? But I'm not thinking of, I have a tax bill due at closing. But when you have an asset heavy business, you do have to think about bulk sales tax law and sales tax law in general. And sometimes if you're buying assets in a certain state, then the sales tax is triggered because you're buying assets. So those are a couple of the different things to think about. And when you don't think of things such as the timeline necessary to do the appraisal of the assets or how the parties will agree upon the purchase price allocation. So the purchase price allocation is how much of the purchase price is allocated to the intangible versus tangible assets of the business, and that can impact the tax consequences of the buyer and seller. So when you're not having these conversations early enough in the transaction, it can really derail your progress because they become those big economic, and they can become those big economic impactful elements of the transaction that remain outstanding. And you always want to make sure that you're having these conversations with an attorney and your accountant as early as possible, particularly in asset heavy businesses. And, I talked about this in my last episode, so I won't go too much into it. But when you're thinking about tax elections and whether a buy side tax election to elect a stock purchase to be taxed as an asset purchase, Whether that would be beneficial is going to depend on how much depreciation is left and what is the value of those assets. In an asset-heavy business, that election may be more worthwhile because the tax savings may be more significant. But if everything's been fully depreciated and everything like that, then that impacts things. So you need to have a conversation about how that financially impacts things and have those deeper conversations with your attorney and accountant early on as possible to make sure that you understand the tax consequences of these. So when your appraiser is going through the appraisal process, there's a lot of different methods of appraisal that they can do. So they can do that for comparables, looking at different comparables, replacement value, lifetime value, current depreciated value. So there are a lot of different ways that an appraiser may look at these different valuations of these assets. You want to be having those conversations and understanding what's going on so that you understand where the appraisal is going to come in and if that might be a potential hindrance and hinder your ability to get financing that you need for the transaction. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com in the show notes to schedule a complimentary consultation. Let's talk about how we can negotiate the valuation discrepancies that you might see within an asset-heavy business. So transparency is really important, and getting the parties aligned on valuation is really important. So talk to the lender and, get more insight as to their appraisal process, because your appraisal process and valuation should match up with their appraisal process and valuation. There are a lot of different ways on how you can bridge those valuation gaps, but it's going to be highly impacted by how your lender values those assets as well. So if, let's say, the lender isn't a part of the conversation and you don't have an appraisal that you're getting through the lender that may provide greater insight into the value of those assets, and you're trying to negotiate it, what might happen is you could have a couple different valuation procedures with appraisers where either you each select an independent appraiser, and then those independent appraisers select a third-party independent appraiser, and then they appraise the assets. That's one option, and that may be final, or someone may be able to appeal it, that you're paying for one appraisal, and you have to have dispute resolutions or different ways of going about finalizing that number if someone doesn't agree with it. So that's one method. Another method, which is more expensive, is that you could each hire an appraiser and have them appraise the assets, and then you either meet in the middle or agree to meet in the middle if there's not more than a certain amount of difference, and if there is a certain amount of those assets may be either appraised by a third party. These are getting pretty expensive that you're not generally going to see in a sub $5 million deal. You're probably going to see that in a greater dollar deal where more is at stake and that appraisal can really be influential. Or you can have one appraisal done and then you agree, and anything you don't agree, it goes to another appraiser, and that then is like split the difference between the two. So there's a lot of different ways that you can structure appraisals and how someone will respond to it and how those numbers are finalized to be able to find something that's fair for both parties. That actually especially works really well in interested party transactions where you're talking about maybe business owners with prior relationships. Maybe it's a supplier and a customer, or where you have a family business and you're looking to value the business. So those are a couple of different mechanisms that you might see in related party transactions, or in transactions where we're just trying to find something that's fair and we agree that we can have a objective method that's easy to understand and apply in this situation and makes sense for the scope of the transaction at hand, and it's not going to be overpowering it. In addition, you could always have the valuation flexibility where there's earnouts or whatnot to bridge purchase price gaps. We really covered this well in the last episode, so I'm not going to go into that in a great amount of detail, but there may be contingent payments or something like that. So in an asset-heavy business, that may not necessarily tie to the valuation of the asset because most of those earnouts or whatnot are tied to revenue, not assets. But they may be a way to nevertheless bridge a purchase price gap between the parties, whether it's derived from a disagreement on the asset value or otherwise. And then overall, the goal is to have a collaborative relationship between the buyer and seller when you're negotiating purchase price and terms and everything like that. So being very conscientious when you're making statements, asking questions, getting information, all of that is super helpful. When you're talking about the research that you need to do into these assets, whether they're getting valued or you're valuing them yourself or something like that, it's important to ask questions about when was it purchased, how much was it purchased for, and this may not be pre-LOI. This is likely well into your due diligence period, but when was it purchased, how much was it purchased for? You should be able to find all this out from the financials. But if you're looking for more than 3 years back, then perhaps they don't include that. And how much would be a replacement be now? And those aren't necessarily questions you have to ask, but rather as the buyer questions you should be investigating. And so getting that information to really understand replacement cost and what is the life of this and how often does it have to be replaced, those are all really typical operational due diligence questions that are going to be asked during the due diligence phase to better understand the asset needs of the business, which are of course really important. And then understanding capital expenditures and at what point there are improvements that need to be made, and is this something that currently functions for the amount of work that the company has, or is this something that would be overwhelmed if the business added 20%, and how long would it take to get another asset like this? Does it take a 2-year installation? Does it take building an entire new building to expand by 20%? Really having a great productive conversation. This is where having a collaborative relationship really means a lot, because when you're a buyer going into a business that you don't know and the seller has so much more knowledge than you do, it's important to have a really positive collaborative relationship throughout the due diligence process, because gathering this information is really important to project out finances, to understand valuation, and overall to make a really good platform to succeed from, to be able to successfully grow the business. And then overall, there can be challenges in transferring the assets. So when you do an asset purchase versus a stock purchase, there can be challenges in transferring assets. And so it doesn't mean that it's going to bar you from purchasing it as an asset purchase, but it is something to think about when you have a company, a busing company, a trucking company with 100 vehicles or something of that nature. You have to think about the complexity of transferring the business as an asset sale versus a stock purchase. Whereas when you purchase it as a stock purchase, it's very easy. You transfer the ownership of the business and you don't have to retitle all of the assets. So in an asset heavy business, thinking practically through, and your attorney will help you with this. This is something, of course, we help our clients with, is thinking through the practicality of an asset purchase versus stock purchase. And when you have an asset purchase, you do have to individually transfer every asset of the business. And when it's an asset heavy business, if that asset has title to it, like vehicles or something similar, you have to make sure that those are all transferred. It is possible, certainly, if it really makes a difference, to have it be an asset purchase versus a stock purchase. But that is one thing that does tend to influence something that may otherwise be better to be a stock purchase. We do have great episodes on asset purchases versus stock purchases. We share how you can get the benefits of an asset purchase in a stock purchase. So overall, there are a lot of considerations when you have an asset heavy business. It is something that so many people don't think about. They think about as a buyer or seller, I could just use templates, or the lawyer's just working with templates, but you really don't understand the nuances that go into every single transaction. This is one example of tens of thousands of examples of how every different deal is so nuanced and different from one another. So these are the things that we're thinking about in the due diligence phase, in the legal documentation phase, in the overall deal structure phase. So being aware of the complexities and nuances that may be involved when you have a different type of industry or a different type of business that you're addressing, such as an asset-heavy business, being aware of how that can really drive complexity and drive the overall structure makes you so much more savvy from a deal-making perspective and elevates your professionalism and understanding of deal-making overall. I hope that this has been really helpful in explaining a couple of the nuances that you may encounter in an asset-heavy business. This isn't exhaustive. There's plenty of things for me to think about to do my job in the way that we need to best support you. If you would like to work with us, we would love to schedule a consultation call. You can do so through the link in our show notes. We would love it if you would subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, leave us a comment on our social media, on our podcast, something that you'd like to hear about next to learn more about the legal aspects of buying and selling businesses. And of course, be sure to pre-order and get on the wait list for my book. Leave it a 5-star review when it comes out. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. Cheers and happy deal making. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and that it brought you one step closer to mastering the art of mergers and acquisitions. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you found value in our discussion, please leave a 5-star review. It would mean the world to us. And share this podcast with your network, friends, and colleagues. For more in-depth resources, be sure to visit our website, deanstreetlaw.com, where you can find articles, guides, and more information on our services. Don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest episodes, updates, tips, and exclusive content. You can find us on LinkedIn, Search Funder, at LMDFrancesco on X, and at Dean Street Law on Instagram. Join us on our next episode where we'll explore more deal-making insights. Cheers and happy deal-making.